This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, Sarah. Thank you for joining me today. Let's begin the interview then with thinking about your journey into Quakers. What what drew you into Quaker meeting, and what did you find, and why have you stayed?
Right. Well, I was brought up a conventional Anglican. I could go on about that for ages, but that's just how it was, a conventional Anglican. And at my parish church, I enjoyed the services. They did a communion to a musical setting, which I liked. And we had a very good vicar. And so on. And then when I went to university, I discovered just how vicar dependent the Anglicans were. And if you had a good vicar, as I had at home, I could get a sense of the numinous. I went to a church in Cambridge where I didn't get that. And I thought, well, I was Anglican because my parents were nominal Anglican. And why don't I make my own choices and look around? So I started looking around. And I had a friend who was in the Open Brethren, and he took me, and they were incredibly welcoming and allowed me to break bread with them and all the rest of it, simply because my friend said, oh yes, this is a Christian. And so on. And I went to the Methodists, who were very jolly and sang lots of hymns. And then a friend of a friend took me to the Quakers. My own friend said, "Oh, he's a Quaker. You might try them." And I was taken to the Quaker meeting at Jesus Lane, and I found it very strange to start with, partly because a couple of my lecturers were in the meeting, and I thought, "Oh gosh, here are people with whom I have a different kind of relationship." And now here they are. And then I was horrified to find young friends talking to my lecturer, and calling him by his Christian name. What? You can't do that. That's Professor so and so. And there they were, exhibiting Quaker equality. And I asked, and this was all explained to me. We used to have quite a big young friends group, and we used to have young friends lunches, and I got to know people. But where I really found it, we had a midweek early morning meeting, and early morning was never really me, but I used to go to these, which was just for young friends. And I found in a smaller group of about a dozen people where I actually knew most of them, where I could actually name most of them people, sitting mostly in silence. And I think waiting, Quakers talk about waiting on God. Waiting was the most appropriate thing. We were waiting for inspiration, waiting for the Spirit together. And together was most important. This was not something I could have done on my own. It was because we were together and because we were friends. And I felt here is something in this meeting which is more than just us sitting here. And in a sense, I've been feeling that ever since. And that was what made me begin to realize what made Quakers tick. And I went on going for a time. I was going with the friend who first took me. We went to Great St Mary's Church, the university church, for the 10 o'clock service, which finished just in time to pop round to Jesus Lane for the 11 o'clock meeting. So we did both. But after not very long, I think we both dropped the Jesus Lane. He was one of those slightly sort of jolly hockey sticks vicar. We used to call him Holy Joe. And whilst I'm sure he was brilliant as a pastor to his congregation, as a minister purely of religion, I think he was not not quite there. He was too much on the secular and community side, which is important, but not enough on, this is where the tenets of the religion inform what you're actually doing. And I did get from Quakers, we had some wonderful people there who talked to young friends. I remember in particular Damaris Parker Rhodes, who did a Swarthmore lecture about 50 years ago. And she was fantastic at getting over what Quaker experience was about. And I began to realize it was all about experience rather than some declared belief. And I began to realize that this was where I felt at home. And then I rather foolishly got married. And this we had a Quaker wedding up in Hull, and we went to the after we'd both finished at Cambridge, we went to live in Kent, and we went to the meeting in Rochester, which was a lovely little meeting. It had a beautiful Grade 2 listed building as its meeting house, and it had been kept going by a brother and sister and one other person for quite a time, and it was gradually building up. And we were very much welcomed as young people. Yeah, let's say it at this point. My wife, because I was a man at that point, my wife was immediately asked to be clerk because she was in membership. And I served as assistant clerk part of the time. So I actually clerked my first meeting before I'd come into membership. I clerked it because Janet was at home. I think she was about to give birth to our eldest, which was quite momentous. And our eldest grew up as a Quaker and became clerk of yearly meeting, which was rather wonderful. And I realized this was very much what I wanted to do. And so I said, I want to join. And when they said to me, why do you want to join? And I said, because I feel one of you. I feel that I am part of the meeting. And I want to say so publicly. And I had a lovely visit from my two visitors, who both of whom I got to know as personal friends over the next few years, and never looked back really. And within a few years, about 8 or 9 years, I suppose, there I was being area meeting clerk, monthly meeting, of course it was in those days. So I was very involved. I found that this was something I could get involved in, and I got sent on a course on how to clerk, and another participant on that was Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who I got to know, which was a wonderful friendship to have, because Jocelyn is a fantastic person. And I just enjoyed being involved at every level. Now, I did some reflecting at some point as to what was my engagement really with this. And I found it, and this is really what keeps me there now, I found it on a spectrum of levels with really two sort of focuses. One of them was the community level. It was very much kind of part of my social life. We used to have people from the meeting round for lunch and so on. And we used to have weekends away and so on. And I loved all that. But right up at the other end, there was the spiritual level, although I hesitate to use that term because I find spiritual applies to everything. I don't. I think it's an artificial distinction to say this is spiritual and that is secular. It's all spiritual because being a Quaker informs what I do. Even when I'm going to the post office to buy stamps for my Christmas cards, I'm still standing in the queue being a Quaker. So anyhow, the top level really came out as the meeting for worship. And the meeting for worship was and is absolutely central to my being a Quaker and why I remain a Quaker and want to remain a Quaker forever. Because what I find in there is, I mean, you might describe it as food for the soul, but that's fancy words.
Mm.
But what it does is to sustain the the way that I, again, using a Quaker metaphor, the way that I keep looking towards the light rather than the darkness, the way I keep trying to do what is right rather than what is selfish or greedy or whatever. Doesn't always work. And there are times when I can rationalize all sorts of things. For example, I don't eschew flying to go on holiday, as many friends do, and I understand exactly why they do. But I look at this and think the amount of damage I do by being one passenger on a plane that's going to Malaga or wherever anyway is so little, and it will sort of it will dampen me down not to go on these things. And when you look at the rate at which China is building coal-fired power stations, and I saw the amount of coal being shipped out of Newcastle. That's not Newcastle upon Tyne, that's Newcastle, Australia, where the coal comes out of the mountains behind it. And the coal all goes to China and gets burned. And when I was there were 12 coal ships waiting to load up. 12! And I thought, okay, I've flown all the way to Australia, but that is nothing to this one load of 12 coal ships. Never mind that this is happening every day, every week. So I stopped worrying about the small stuff. There's a wonderful book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and that became small stuff. At the same time, I am very aware that it's highly convenient to call it small stuff and then saying, well, I'm going to do it anyway. You have to be very careful, and you have sometimes to realize that you are finding a balance between keeping yourself afloat in a good place and keeping the world as ecologically sustainable as you can. And over recent years, sustainability has become very important to me, to the extent I actually joined the Green Party a couple of years ago, because I felt this is, next to Quakerism, this is my driver, and I think it's a Quaker driver as well.
Mm.
So there's quite a bit in that, isn't there?
There is. Yes,
Uh,
there is.
of what's going on. But
Well,
that's where it all started, and some of what keeps it going.
so what I was really, well, there's a lot in there, as you say. I was struck that you talked about while being a young friend, um, that some key people were so effective at talking to you, and talking to the group of you. Perhaps I'm imagining you were in your 20s, Ben.
Yeah,
Um, what is it that those people were saying? And I suppose what I'm interested, you see, is, I mean, I'm past 50 now, and I'm just thinking about what is it that those of us who are in the second half of our lives, what what do we give to young people? And I'm very aware that your story began in the Anglican Church, so there's a Christianity that's at the foundation of your experience, and therefore a teaching around that. And one of the things that concerns me greatly is that we're not really grounding our young people in the wisdom tradition that we're, founded on in Christianity. And yet what we are talking about is much more about what you talked about at the end around the Green Party or environmental politics or activism. And I wonder whether we get the balance quite right. What do you make of all of that?
Well, yes, that interests me greatly. Um, I, I, I was quite a naive child. As I grew up, I believed what I was told. But the first chink in that came when I was about 11. And my school used to have every year, we used to go to a service in a local church on Ascension Day. And I was telling my mother, we'd walked down and been to this Ascension Day service. And she said to me, I suppose, she said, some people believe that Jesus's body was actually carried up off the earth. And I said, well, yes, that's what we're taught. And she explained to me that this was perhaps a metaphor, an allegory, something that people like to think of as a way of explaining something about the relationship between this amazing teacher of Jesus and the way that they saw the power behind the existence of the universe. Um, and it never occurred to me that this wasn't literally true. And as I grew older and started to study science, I realized that it could not possibly have been literally true, and that this was a myth that was put forward by people writing 30 to 60 to 90 years later. And it was something that had come about by a sort of Chinese whisper kind of process. And that there may well be meaning behind it. But an actual physical body with mass, ignoring gravity and rising up into a cloud, no way. And if you were required to believe that, then only stupid people would believe it. Well, no, that is pejorative, and I don't mean stupid people. I mean only people who have a mindset that is not inclined to follow the logic of science would believe it. Now, I believed in God in those days. I believed in a creator who was an external supernatural being who took an interest in the affairs of human beings on this little planet and occasionally intervened in it.
Mm.
I had heard the miracles at Lourdes. There was all the stuff that the Catholic did with potential saints having to perform 2 miracles in order to tick the sainthood box, and so on. I thought, yes, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy. I was well aware in the medical field that there were people who got better because they were determined to, and didn't get better because they weren't determined to, and that there was a crossover between mind and body that the medics did not want to talk about because it didn't fit their teaching. And I thought, no, they should be doing this because there is something there and we don't know what it is. So there were things around I didn't know, but I believed in a God and a God who did and could intervene occasionally. That view has changed gradually over the years. And about 10 years ago, I actually joined the non-theist Friends. I was quite taken by the arguments of David Bolton, who's a very persuasive man, though I don't agree with him in a lot of ways. And I was active in the non-theist network for a time, and then I've even moved on from there. because I have an idea of something that I can call God, but which is not a being. I think it's very, I can't remember who it was. Somebody said man made God in his own image rather than the other way around. And I think that's absolutely true. And if you look back at sort of prehistory, different people have made their gods, and all their gods are creatures similar to the ones they've seen. Mostly humans. Some of the Indian ones are not. But what the heck? Um, their gods have been things within their own experience. And for me, God is necessarily outside. The totality of God is outside our experience, but we can experience something of it. And it's in meeting that we do that.
So, I mean, I heard something the other day about this idea that if we say that there is something beyond us, then we have something to offer to young people and to the generations that follow us. Whereas if we say there's nothing out there, we have nothing to offer them. Um, and I just wondered where you sit today then. Where is your view today in terms of if you are uh, teaching the next generation anything about your spiritual experience, what is it that you're saying now?
Yeah, I am definitely in there is something out there camp. And I am in that camp because I experience it.
Mm,
I experience it, not always, but usually in meeting for worship. We have, since we came back after COVID, we've had a lunchtime in person midweek meeting in Darlington, which I go to as often as I can. And in that little meeting, which is not always, but usually totally silent, just for half an hour, and with anything from 2 to, I think, 8 is the largest I've known it. Um, just with those people there in that quiet room, all of us there because we want to be there, because we want to be doing this thing together, which we call worship, which I think is an awful misnomer. Um, to an extent, I'll come back to that. But because we're doing it together, and I find there is this something that is more than what we're there. And I found that, as I said earlier, since the early days, that there is something, and I've never lost that there is something. I remember the first non-theist conference I went to before I'd actually joined the group, and I came back from that with one word, and that word was beyond. There is something beyond.
mm,
And a lot of them would not have agreed with me. Um, Several of them were humanists, and that I couldn't get on with. I went to talk about Quakerism to the Newcastle humorist group when I was in Newcastle meeting. And the humanists seemed so sort of almost violently anti-religion,
mm,
although they had a lot in common with Quakers. And I think they were about to include being a peace group as part of their ethos. And they believed in equality, and they believed in simplicity, and they believed in helping others. And there
mm.
was a lot in common, but this one violent thing that we will not have gods around. They are a nuisance in the way. And for me, no, 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 no. Let us just be aware that whatever God is can be a fluid concept, and we have to find what it is. And we find it from not from what people wrote down 2,000 years ago, not from what people preach to us in a pulpit. We find it from our own experience, and that's the only way you can find it.
And do you find that having had a rich grounding in Christianity, you were in a quite a privileged position in the sense of having the fortune of having 2,000 years of wisdom, 2,000 years of human experience?
Yes, I think so. Um, one of the things that distresses me is that an awful lot of what goes on in Christian churches isn't Christianity. It's well, when I got married for the second time, I married a gorgeous man in 2015, and he was an active Anglican. I mean, he'd been an organist and choir master. He'd been a church treasurer. He'd been as involved in the Anglicans as I was in the Quakers. And we came to this very amicable arrangement that we would go to St. Cuthbert's, the parish church in Darlington, which is a wonderful church, 900 years old, and steeped in church and personal history. Every other week, and we would go to the meeting every other week. And I found that in the church, what they concentrated on absolutely was what you believed. And they got up and said the creed, we believe in this, that, and the other, a whole lot of things. And there was scarce a word about how you live your life. And then in the Quakers, we concentrate on how you live your life. And there is scarce a word about the foundation of it. Rex Ambler, wonderful man, wrote a book about, I can't remember what it was called. I think it was the Quaker Way or something like that. And he said, look, we are not a church of belief, we are a church of experience. I thought that was very, very perceptive, but I now think, actually, no, Rex, I think you're wrong. We are a church of both belief and experience. And if our belief does not underpin our experience, then really we are nothing. And this is where people who are worried that we should not become a secular pressure group, this is why I absolutely understand that. Because yes, we understand that if you go around being nice to people, being fair, sharing things, wanting people to be more equal and so on, our experience is that makes for a better society. Yes, sure. But if you do not underpin that by saying there is some spirit is the best word I can do. Spirit in the sense of a really good school has a spirit of hard work and play and the rest of it. You can say things like a team spirit. There is a spirit of that is could be expressed in the Quaker Testament. It's a spirit of love and peace and truth and equality and simplicity and sustainability that embodies all those values. And that is something as tangible as a being. And it's what I call God. It is this whole sense, but it's not something with a mind. I get. I think it's very difficult for me when people talking about saying God likes this and God doesn't like that. No, this is in accordance with the Spirit of God. Or this isn't in accordance, yes, but it is somebody sitting there thinking, that's not good. You have to have this underpinning of the experience. So we have a belief that it is right to tell the truth, for example. That's a belief. And our experience is that if we tell the truth, then we are better people and life is better. So we have both of these two going hand in hand. And I think that's quite important. And the belief coming out of the Christian teaching of the last 2,000 years, yes, that's very helpful. Although it can come out of other traditions. You ask Harvey Gilman, brought up as a Jew. We had a friend in Cambridge Young Friends who was brought up as a Buddhist and was a Buddhist Quaker. Now, there's in a sense there's a dichotomy, because Buddhists don't, of course, believe in a god, but yes, they do. In a sense, they believe in my sort of god. So it can come out of other traditions, but Quakerism, on the whole, comes out of the Christian tradition. It comes out of the teaching of Jesus as we know it. And it is that teaching, rather than the beliefs in any myths about his birth and his resurrection and all the rest of it. That to me is the sort of the frame around the picture. It's what's in the picture that's important. The frame doesn't, in the end, really terribly matter.
So you see, one of the things I would say is that I experience the presence of God. I experience that. It's not just a belief. Um, and what worries me is, do we say that in enough in Quakers? Is it a core part of Quaker experience? Is it something that we say, well, look, there is this thing that you can experience, and if you're not experiencing it, then, you're missing out, and this is something worth practicing, if you like.
Yeah, I think probably we should say it more. We had a wonderful day recently in the area meeting about prayer, because prayer kind of implies a God. If you are praying, it has to be to somebody or something. And we got really quite deep in it. And I think a lot of people went away with something to take from that, about there being this thing beyond whatever you call it. I mean, I love Rhiannon Grant's thing of God or whatever you call it, which is brilliant. I think Rhiannon is absolutely super in that. And yes, I think people did take that away. But we don't do all that much. We did a little thing in Darlington meeting. We had three of us, myself as a non-theist at the time, one friend who's a universalist, and one friend who was a much more conventional Christian. And we were each explaining different aspects of our belief, to anybody who cared to turn up. But the problem with doing that is that the people who turn up tend to be the people who need it least. And actually getting the right audience there is can be quite difficult. I look around meeting, at times at the beginning, and see the number of people who are reading. And you have people who spend quite a lot of time reading the friend. And to my mind, that is wasting the meeting. You can read the friend or other things at different times. Even faith and practice, which can provide you with a bit of inspiration. Of course, I mean, there are some wonderful things in faith and practice. But if you are sitting reading, not only are you not being quiet because your eyes aren't quiet and your mind isn't quiet, you're concentrating on words, you're not engaging with the meeting either. There's you and the book, and the rest of the meeting can go hang as far as you're concerned. You probably don't think like that. Oh, no. But no, it's not engaging with the meeting, and it's not only wasting the meeting. The meeting is not benefit from having you as engaging with it. And for me, I think I've said already, one of the things about meeting is having everybody there doing it, whatever it is. We are all there with that sincerity of purpose, of trying to get into the depths of things, and of just what are we as human beings. And I find that very difficult. I have no idea who we are as human beings. I get fascinated by the whole idea of consciousness and what happens when you go to sleep and aren't conscious and it comes back next morning until you're dead when it doesn't. Um,
Yeah.
it's all a complete mystery. And that just shows me, yes, there are still mysteries. There are things we don't know. We have to accept there are things we don't know. And we have to try and just find who we are and what this is that drives us. And the meeting keeps us going in that direction rather than going off and wanting to make lots of money and be powerful and never mind other people.
Mm.
Um, the meeting keeps us on that path of the light, or the
You
path that we
see,
the light.
I'm thinking about how different our experience of that, grounded in a Christian tradition. Because if you imagine young people today, they're growing up in a radically different world. And, apart from all the technology and global changes, but in terms of their education, in terms of religious education, they're simply not grounded in any faith tradition, like we were half a century ago. It was simply a very different learning environment for children. So what I'm very aware of is generations of young people coming into Quakers will see the testimonies, will see the activism, and will see a lot of sitting in quiet with perhaps people reading, as you say. And I just wonder, what do we know what it is that they're getting from that experience and whether God has anything to do with it at all? And I think we're so reticent and so quiet about what we actually are trying to experience. And we're so open-minded and so kind of relaxed and permissive about what people are doing for all very good reasons. I just wonder sometimes that we're getting that balance wrong.
Yes, I think we are. Um, the difficulty I have is where on earth are the young people? Because in our meeting, we have lovely lad who is now about 1.5. We have a young man who comes very occasionally who is just started secondary school in September. And the next youngest is the lad's father, I should think, who will be in his 30s,
Mhm.
and then very rapidly we get up to the retired.
Mm.
We can very easily do things in the day because nearly everyone's retired. Um, Finding the young people to say things to, that's quite difficult. It heartens me that we're still getting oversubscribed during a yearly meeting and that kind of thing. But it is a bit thinner. When we do, as you say, what is their experience? When we have this thing out in the world where you're not supposed to stick up a sign saying Happy Christmas because it's offensive to Muslims or Hindus or whatever, and you
True.
say
Is that
joy, joyful winter equinox or some sort of thing. Uh, um, I put on a Christmas cake one time called Welcome Yule, um, which is out of Britain's ceremony of carols, because a lot of it is the old Yule tide. It's the winter festival. And the Christians actually took that over when they invented Christmas. But we, we we are reticent in saying that our teaching comes from a particular teacher
Mm.
of 2,000 years who said some very extraordinary things like love your enemies.
Mm.
Tell me another teacher. Muhammad said, go and strike them down and kill a lot of them. Not quite the same thing. And the Jewish God of the Old Testament is forever slaughtering people. So there's this thing of love your enemies and bless them that curse you. Wow. and you look at the recorded teaching of Jesus, and it is all about how to live this life of loving and forgiving. Forgive, do I forgive to 7 times? You forgive to 70 times 7. You forgive infinitely. Um, the, and so much of what Jesus says, you look at the Sermon of the Mount, it's all about how to live your life. And then, as I said, you go to church, and none of it's about how to live your life. It's all about what myths you subscribe to, which saddens me, because I think that if you follow the teaching of Jesus, it is about how you go about everyday living, and there's a richness in that that we have because we were brought up with it. Nowadays, when you do RE in schools, you do comparative religion and you learn about the tenets of the other Abrahamic religions and the Buddhism and Sufism and all the rest of it. And it's a sort of academic subject that doesn't actually relate to you personally.
Mm.
And that's a pity.
Yes, I think that certainly has a place, and I think it's all part of a rounded education. I fully support that, and I also think that if we are to live our lives a certain way, and for Quakers as a religious group to really advise and to help people develop their spiritual practice, we need to know where that's come from. So I'm very much feeling like the lack of Christian teaching within Quakers at the moment is quite a serious drawback. And although we do that perhaps to be more open and inclusive, in fact, I think it pushes people away. And it means that people drift off to other churches much more than we think.
Yes, possibly. Um, I find it difficult because I mean we've actually been very, I don't know if it's fortunate or what, we've had lots of people come into our meetings since COVID. We've had people who've dropped in, people who've used our meeting house and want to know what it's all about, um, people who've seen us standing around with a banner in the market, saying peace now, and so on. All kinds of reasons why people come in, and they have liked what they've found. A lot of them have come and said, "Oh yes, I'll come again." And we've had interesting conversations after meeting, and a lot of it happens in the conversations after meeting. We don't. We used to talk about a teaching ministry, and people don't, on the whole, get up and minister about the Christian tenets that that were in Quakerism from the word go. Um, I have actually read the Bible in ministry, and it's a rare thing. And when I have, it's been more often the Old Testament than the New because it's got such wonderful poetry. I like it. And it is a thought, and maybe I should think about reading more myself through the actual teaching of Jesus. And I won't get on to St. Paul because I think St. Paul put his own face on Christianity. And it's a face that I don't totally get on with. And I think Pauline Christianity has not actually been terribly beneficial. But Paul was one of these personalities, who
So you
like
see,
to.
you know enough about it to even have those thoughts and have those criticisms and have that reflection within yourself.
Yes,
Mm.
yes, and yes, I am grateful to Mr. Harbert, who did our basic. Um, uh, what do we call it? We didn't call it Bible study. We didn't call it. I think we called it religious education. When I was, quite young, from the age of 9 or
Mm,
onwards, and I think what we learned then, what we learned from what we learned about what is in the Bible and what it said, and I've learned subsequently of my own volition and seeking out more about how the Bible was written and what there is about it,
mm,
uh, and how it all grew up and went forward. And I was particularly interested in the Council of Nicaea, which quite literally defined Christianity by setting out a creed,
mm,
um, and sent Bishop Arius away with a flea in his ear, when in my view he had actually got an insight that they should have listened to.
mm,
Um,
mm.
which was saying, look at the teaching, not at the person.
Yeah. And this is the thing, I suppose I wonder sometimes, you said about newcomers and a lot of people are retired. And I think that is apparently common. I mean, we heard in the Future of Quakerism conference about some of these statistics, and we're still getting a lot of people joining us as they retire in their 60s. We're getting a we continue to be an older society, but I think of that as being a society of elders. And I think there's a great richness in that, you know? And I think that's what I don't know if admire is quite the right word, but look up to in some way. I think that's a really valuable thing to provide wider society as well as Quakers. And I do wonder sometimes if we're confident in our eldership, because it's all very well saying, oh well, we're confident in being activists around the environment or peace or equality. But where does that come from? Where do we get our authority from for that? And I worry sometimes that we're very confident on the outcomings of it, the outpourings of that, without being able to back up, well, this is the presence in our midst, if you like, that is underpinning those ideas.
Yes, I remember once being led to minister about how I saw all the Quaker testimonies stemming directly from the teaching of Jesus. Um, that if it wasn't for that teaching, our testimonies would just be somebody's idea. But no, this is something that is rooted in this particular way of life. And I love that advice that says Christianity is not a notion but a way. I think Quakerism also is not a notion but a way.
Yeah.
It's a way to do things. I hadn't thought of that, but I like the idea, the concept that we are a society of elders, or a lot of us are a society of elders. Because, yes, there is a fair amount of collective wisdom. Um, Although I think we need our younger people
Of course.
as well, to become the next lot of elders going on. Um, but we're all so busy these days. It's all a bit difficult to do.
Well,
But I think you're right. We do need to have a what you might call a religious backing, a religious authority for it. Otherwise, who are we to say you must not have nuclear weapons and translate that into cutting the wire at USAF bases and things like that? Um, we've got to have something there. Interesting. One of the big experiences of my life was taking part in the first performance of Tony Biggins' cantata, The Gates of Greenham, which told the story of the Greenham Common women. And we did that as long ago, that was Easter Monday 1985. Never to be forgotten day, singing in the Royal Festival Hall, where I was brought up to see the great and the good of music. And the Greenham Common women were, of course, secular. They were not. They were not a religious group. Some of them were Quakers, some of them weren't. and some of them were almost aggressively not. And some of them were actually quite aggressive for a peaceful group of people. But there you had a protest that was, it was as much about being women as it was about being peaceful. And sometimes it was more about being women than being peaceful. And I think for that reason, it wasn't entirely as successful as it might have been. Um, and I think, I'm thinking out loud a bit here, but I think with the kind of authority that you're talking about, there might have been something a little further to go on. But as it was, the clash between them and the Americans was simply a difference between people's views, and who's to say who's right and who's wrong. Whereas the rightness of what Quakers do is informed by the teaching of a great religious teacher, who was himself, I think, in no doubt that he was speaking the message of God. I mean, there have been lots of religious teachers who's given a rather different message of God, so you have to be a bit wary of that. But I think in the case of Jesus, there is an authority there, that informs Quaker activism, and that Quaker activism would be much diminished without.
Mm. Yes, well, I very much agree with you on that. Can we go back then to talking a bit about community and we've talked a lot about God. So
Yeah.
how important do you think next to God, or perhaps equally as important, is that sense of fellowship and having a group of people who encourage us and guide us and support us along the way?
For me, it is absolutely wonderful to be able to go into a meeting house on a Sunday almost anywhere in the country and feel welcome, feel at home. And if there isn't somebody there I know, there's somebody there who I have friends in common with. It is wonderful being part of the whole national community, and that's because I've been to yearly meetings much more often than not,
Yeah.
since 1960 something. And so I know and am known by an awful lot of people. Um, at the local level, in a sense, it's almost the whole of my kind of social life. I've been living in Darlington since I got married in 2015. And the number of people I know in Darlington other than Quakers is very, very few, almost nobody. I used to know a few more because my husband was a great bridge player and we used to go to the bridge club. Since he died, um, I haven't done anything much in Darlington, and I know very few people. Um, that's partly because I have a partner who lives 25 miles away. So I am often going over there, and he is often coming over here. He's sitting downstairs at the moment, having fed him breakfast. And so we are in two different places, and he is more introvert than I am. So he knows, well, he knows some people in his own community, but not that many. And we tend to get on very nicely by ourselves as a couple. Um, but yes, I think the community thing is something that is sustainable, but it's also sustainable because there is what I call the gang culture. You see this in a bad way when you see football hooligans sort of ripping up
Mm.
train carriages and so on. They do things in a gang that they wouldn't do individually. And I think Quakers do things in a gang positively, that they wouldn't do individually. And I've certainly been on demonstrations and things where I felt a little bit uncomfortable, but it's okay because I'm surrounded by the like-minded.
Yeah.
Um, and that makes it possible. So I think the gang do help to sustain you in just in being who you are, and in having your place. And there's one thing I've left out, which I really do want to put in. Um, in the middle of my life, I got very involved in Quakers centrally, partly because I was working in technology and I got asked to go and help a study in what was then Quaker social responsibility in education, to look at the effects of new technology on people. And I got more involved, and eventually I became the clerk of the Central Committee. And then I got to clerk the Working Party, which set up the present finance system of yearly meetings, because it was an absolute pig's ear before that. So I got very involved centrally. And part of it was very personally validated. I felt, I really was somebody. I was a worthwhile person because I was the person who was clerking this. Wow, you're somebody. And I observed this and recognized it. And I thought, well, yes, don't let that take you over. But it's perfectly okay to see. Yes, you are validated by other people, and you are validating them as well.
Mm.
This is nice on that level, so long as it isn't the sole reason for doing it, which of course it wasn't by any manner of means. Um, and so there is this thing within the community. And I've never forgotten when I was first asked to be on a nominations committee, and the conveners explained to me, we try and find a job for everyone. I thought, what? I thought we were here to find people for jobs, not jobs for people. I was wrong. Nominations committees are there to find ways of growing the community by people
Mm.
doing the right jobs for them. And I learned an awful lot about nominations committee. I eventually ended up teaching at Woodbrook courses on how to do nominations.
Mm.
Very interesting. I love doing that. Um, so yes, the community is a way of of helping people to be the person that they can be.
Yeah.
Never forgotten that lovely line in one of Alec Davidson's productions that says, "Take me for what I am,
Mm.
make me what I could be." And I think that's what Quaker communities are about. We take you for what you are, with no restrictions, no requirements, no bars to cross,
Mm.
and we make you what you could be.
I mean, I think that's a wonderful. I haven't heard that saying before, and I think that's wonderful. I mean, I am aware that you have been Quaker such a long time, and you have been through transition yourself. And in 2021, just recently, we had Minute 31, which said we welcome and affirm trans people, etc. I wonder if you wanted us to say anything about that. I mean, why did we need that minute? Um, we've talked about Quaker community and being taking you as you are, and forming us as characters, perhaps. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes. When I transitioned, this was around the time of the millennium. I mean, it was a transitioning time for everybody, really. Um, the penny had finally dropped. And I mean, it's a long story, but Quakers were actually involved because I got into a little Quaker group of people like that through some comments that people were making on what was then the Quaker Bee mailing list. And so then there was a hand in it. And we had this incredible lunch in I think, about 1998. Four of us, all of whom were trans Quakers, trying to find our place in the world and our place in Quaker. Some were finding it more difficult with the Quakers than others, but for various reasons. With one of those four, I am still closely in touch. You know, we're best mates, and we talk to each other on the phone. Well, several times, a couple of times a month on average, I should think, and support each other in all sorts of ways. But yes, and I went through this, and my meeting was incredibly supportive. And I'd actually become an elder about 2 years before I transitioned, and went on being an elder right through it, and for 3 years after. So I was an elder right through the whole thing. I was also the clerk of the British Committee of the Quaker Council for European Affairs, which supports the Quaker office in Brussels. And I went on clerking that, and I said to them, you know, this is what I'm doing, and do you want me to go on clerking you? And I said, I'll go out and let you talk about it without me. And they talked about it without me. When I came back, they said, well, the thing we've got to organise is getting the signatory on the cheques right. That's all you're bothered about? But other than that, no, they weren't bothered. And for a time, I before I'd made the final total transition, was being a bit half and half. And I used to go over to Brussels because my passport was in my male name. And I used to get to friend's house, and I used to change and become Sarah. I remember once, you know, being Sarah for the whole weekend, and then changing, going out to Brussels airport, running into somebody who I'd been with the meeting. Oh, good gracious. Yeah, the Quakers were very supportive. But in those days, it was a relatively unusual thing. Although I have to say, I was actually on Meeting for Suffering shortly after that. It was the old Meeting for Suffering, so it was a big body of about, I think, 180 people or something like that. But even so, a relatively low number. And on that body were 3 trans women. 3, 180, a huge proportion. I mean, quite incredible. And one of them was incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly useful when it came to the leasing of Courtauld House and all that. Things have moved on so much in this century, and it's become almost a sort of commonplace. People have seized on this almost as a fashion. You know, we can blame this, that, or the other on gender, and I think I'd like to be a different gender today, but perhaps not tomorrow. And I think people are confusing something which is very basic in yourself, the whole idea of gender dysphoria, where all of you is somehow a misfit. And I'd felt a misfit most of my life. And it wasn't until I was 58 that the penny dropped as to why. And lots of people commented to me how much more I was in my own skin afterwards. That's one thing. And people who are just feeling confused about the modern world, which is very understandable, but who really don't know what's what. And I think it was a couple of years ago, I did a conversation as part of an online yearly meeting with Fred Language and with a young person who called themselves Gray, which was actually their surname. And I knew their grandfather quite well, as it happened, who was what I would describe as gender confused, who didn't know about an awful lot of things, and gender was one of them. And we talked about the problems and the difficulties and so on. And this was available online to anybody who wanted to watch. I don't know how many people watched it, and I never had any outside feedback from it. But it was a very interesting conversation.
I never knew about that, and I certainly haven't seen it. No. I mean, I'm really interested in what you're saying here because if you think about it on the surface, if in 2021 we needed a minute to welcome and transfer, oh gosh, welcome and affirm trans and non-binary people, um, why did we need that minute if you're saying that you were welcomed decades prior to this? What worries me a little bit is that there's some feeling like we're not welcoming, like we're not inclusive, and yet you've just given us stories where there's a huge amount of representation um, in our national bodies and structures. You yourself can testify to how welcomed and supported you've been, and every Quaker I've met says, "Well, of course we're welcoming." So why do you feel that we had this need to minute this in a particular way? Do you have any sense of that?
I think some people were a bit frightened of people who were basically um, men who put a skirt on. Nobody's ever been frightened of a woman who puts a suit on, trousers and a jacket and a tie, because they've been doing that for years.
Hmm.
Um, and still being women, it's allowed. But for a man to wear a skirt, oh, wow. And I absolutely applaud a friend of mine from Birmingham who used to turn up to Quaker meetings in a skirt and a pretty blouse with no intention of being female. He
Mm.
was a man. He just wanted to wear these clothes to say, why shouldn't I? And he was making, I think, a very valid point. He was a lovely man. And he had a perfectly normal heterosexual relationship with a woman, and they had a child. I don't know if he ever married her. But, this was somebody actually saying, look, there's no reason why not. But I think nowadays, where people are doing all this sort of self identifying, which I find difficult because I would never have had the confidence. The reason I went to a psychiatrist was to say, look, I have these feelings. Are they because I'm really a woman underneath, or are they something different that I don't know about? And can you go into that? And he did to a very small extent. It wasn't actually that good. But fortunately for me, it all worked out because I really was. But people do this self-identifying, and they think, oh, I can put a dress on and call myself a woman. And some of them, unfortunately, go around then being predatory, and that, of course, gives trans people a bad name. And the politicians haven't got a clue what to do with it. And I think the Scots got it seriously wrong by saying anybody who wants to can just call themselves a different gender. Um, no, you can't do that. Gender is more fundamentally than that, and you need support. You need somebody to take you through a process, and you need to be clear that this is something that is fundamental and permanent, and not, as we've seen in several cases, people who change and then change back and so on. People who want to be a woman but who would be horrified at the thought of reassignment surgery and so on. It's all become much more sort of almost superficial nowadays. That people do this at the drop of a hat. And I think we needed a minute to say, look, whatever state you're in, um, we will actually welcome everybody.
Hmm.
Um, because there were people who were just sort of a little bit uncomfortable um, people. I mean, we had that very courageous young person at yearly meeting, about 3 years ago, or was it just before COVID, who came very obviously male, very obviously dressed as a woman, and got up and spoke quite movingly about where they were in this. And I think a lot of people felt bit uncomfortable with this person because it represented something they didn't know and
Mhm.
they didn't understand. When you've been through that process, you have much more of a feeling um, for the kind of issues that come up and why you feel the need to wear a skirt and to identify and have a woman's name. Whether that is something that is going on for your life or whether that is just part of a process you're going through and will come out the other side of. So yes, I think we needed a minute because the whole nature of being trans has changed somewhat.
Mm. It does seem to have, yes. Well, I just wonder if you could help me understand the word affirm and what you think it means in this context. Because there are some people I've spoken to who think of the word affirm, um, thinking about affirming each other as human beings, as Quakers, as unique, precious children of God, those kinds of ideas. What, what's your reading of that minute in terms of the word affirm?
Um, oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, my immediate thought on that word was my experience when, very soon after my transition, I went on a course at Woodbrook with the late, great John Puncheon. And because of what was happening, I did what hadn't intended to do and um, explained to the group that one of my biggest problems was getting my youngest daughter to accept my gender change. When I said gender change, they all looked, huh? And next morning at breakfast, dear Jackie Leach Scully, who was a wonderful woman, great scientist, and who I knew because she was in Newcastle meeting when she wasn't in Switzerland. And she came up to me and she said, how do you feel if people say I'd have never have guessed? I said, it's very affirming.
Mm.
It's something that says, I hear what you are and I completely accept it. So I think that is what we are saying in the minute, that we hear where you are, somewhere different on the gender spectrum to most of us, and we do completely accept that.
And what if somebody says, I recognize that you're trans and that you have a right to do that and I wish you well. However, I see you as fundamentally male and I can't avoid that. That is my perception of you. And therefore there's issues around the toilets and the changing rooms and various things like that. Do you feel that, I mean, how do you manage those if you have those kinds of conversations or encounters, or that those views are held within Quakers as well as elsewhere? How do you manage and negotiate those?
Well, it never happened to me, um, which in a sense is affirming in its own in itself. But I think if it did, I would simply try and explain to somebody the difference between sex and gender, which is not always understood at all. And there was a very helpful post on Facebook quite recently about the different and curious things chromosomes can do, and the bit of the Y chromosome that um, produces male characteristics can actually jump to the X chromosome. You get all sorts of different peculiar combinations. So actually saying a woman is a woman is simply medically not so. There are all sorts of different stages in between. I would try and explain to somebody um, the differences. I would explain about what happens with gender reassignment surgery, for example. And because I think a lot of people don't really understand that. And if they said yes, but you're still a man at heart, and I would say, well, that's just the point. I'm not. I'm finding it difficult to understand why your perception um, is what's it based on, because it's not based on anything in the present. I haven't. Well, I don't think I've ever been truly male, and I certainly haven't had male characteristics for the last 25 years. So, what are you basing
Yes,
your
I suppose one of the things you said earlier was that things have changed recently, nowadays, and that I've had people point out that not everyone is having reassignment surgery. And there is a fluidity sometimes for people where they're, exploring and changing. And yet there is still an expectation for people to, for example, use toilets which they feel most comfortable in, even if perhaps other women it affects women mainly, doesn't it? That other women perhaps would rather not have somebody who is obviously male and hasn't gone through any reassignment surgery in their space. And of course this is happening in wider society, but it is still something that is happening in Quakers as well, isn't it? We're still going through that. Um,
Yes, I think we are to an extent. We it always takes time for these things to catch up. I think in 50 years' time, we'll look back and say, how on earth did it take us so long? But we all know that Quakers take ages to do anything. So why should we expect this to be anything? Um, yes, we do have people who have difficulties. I think, again, one of the things that people never say is that trans people expect, I mean, a lot of them really expect other people to bend over backwards to accept where they are. They don't seem to be ready to bend over backwards to accept where other people are. They
mm,
don't, take your example of using the toilet. Somebody who has transitioned from male to female but not had surgery, they want to use a female toilet because they feel more comfortable there. They don't want to be in with a load of men who they don't feel aligned with. But they need to recognize that women are not comfortable with a person with male genitalia using their toilet. That there is something uncomfortable about that, and certainly about being in women only spaces. And there's a lot of people who write things from ignorance about that. I would personally feel somewhat upset if I was excluded from a woman only space. I would want to know why. Why do you not think I don't have male genitals? I have more or less female. I behave like a woman. Why should I be excluded? I'm not a threat any more than any other woman. There are predatory women, and there are people born women, brought up women, been women all their lives, who perhaps are a threat in women only spaces. Do they not know that? It's not as cut and dried. None of it is as cut and dried as some of these people think. And when I heard Kemi Badenoch, before she was leader of the Tory party, saying she thought all trans people should use the toilets of the sex they were born in. And I thought, really?
mm.
Um, I would find that physically difficult, never mind anything else. And I wouldn't do it, and nobody would ever know.
What do you make of gender neutral toilets?
Yeah, why not? If that's a help, why not? Um, uh,
For example, why not might be because some women don't want that. Um, so what do you
oh,
make
I think that would need to be in addition to
in addition?
single, right? Not exclusively so. I mean, there are, if you're on a train, you have gender neutral toilets willy nilly.
Oh
Um,
yes, yes. Single use toilets like that. I don't think anyone's having an issue with that. But the thing that I'd like to just kind of put as the last example is, and I'm not sure if you know, young friends have a policy of when they come to stay at a meeting house,
Yeah.
they unilaterally put a sign on the men's saying gender neutral with urinals, and they put a sign on the women's saying gender neutral with sanitary bins. Without talking about it with a meeting, without having any discussion or permission, or and that means that on a Sunday morning when you arrive, you're faced with a gender neutral situation in the toilets. Now that doesn't it's not just it doesn't suit some people. Some women get actively, very upset and worried about that. What do you make of
I think doing something like that is fine when they are exclusively in that space. They can do what they like. When they are sharing the space with the owners, as it were, I think it is a great discourtesy not to negotiate something like that with them. And I think they should understand that there will be older friends who find that difficult. And please, whilst we are in our meeting house and you are our guests, please can you stick to our rules rather than your rules? Because that's common courtesy. And I think that's an example of people being aggressive
Mm.
in, aggressively peaceful, as it were. It's very possible to be aggressively inclusive.
Yes. You see, that was my mind, and I took the sign down off the ladies which said gender neutral. I placed it carefully on the side so that they could reuse it later when they're using the meeting exclusively. But somebody put it back up again. So, and I thought, yes, this for me is where you cross the line, and as you say, it's a discourtesy. And that these things need to be negotiated. And perhaps we just can't come to an agreement on that just yet.
Yes, I think that's right. But, one of the things about pacifism, to me, is that you don't do things that are, as it were, acts of war, even if the war isn't a fighting um, to try and kill enemies. It's a war of attrition, a war of um, gender, a war of anything. Um, you don't do acts of war. You work peacefully and you work cooperatively and you work together. And doing something like that, which is not being peaceful and cooperative, that to me is unquakerly.
Yes. Yes. And it comes back to what we started out with, saying, where does this authority come from that gives us this testimony of peace in the first place?
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so, what is your hopes for the future of Quakerism then? Just to finish, are you hopeful about the future?
No, actually, I am a bit of a pessimist. I think we spend an awful lot of time navel gazing and looking at ourselves, and quite a lot of recent yearly meetings have been much more internal than external. I think we are kind of looking for a role in a very changed world, and the world has changed a lot in the last 25 years, never mind the rest of it. And when you think of how different a world it is since the Manchester Conference of 1896, we need another Manchester Conference. Perhaps the future of Quakerism was it. And I was sad not to be able to go to that. But I think we need to be clear um, about how much we are a group based on belief of myth and how much our belief is sort of more beyond specifics. So, for example, I don't think our belief should have to include belief in the resurrection.
Mm.
Whereas there are still quite a lot of Quakers for whom the resurrection is the whole validation of Christianity and absolutely crucial to the whole thing. That kind of belief, I think we have to say, that's, the way you express it is up to you. It's what lies behind it that's important, and it is in the living presence that we sense in meeting. That is where our authority is. But we must make sure that we are still aware of that, and that we talk about the teachings of love, the teachings of forgiveness, the teachings of um, how you live your life that are there in the Bible from Jesus. That's the Christianity that we started with, and that is the bit we need to hang on to. And perhaps if we did more of that, we could then say, here we've got a basis for our testimonies, which are absolutely where they should be, and to keep them fundamentally as where we are, and to push them forward to the wider world.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Sarah. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
We've been a long time, haven't we? But I think we've covered quite a lot. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.